Next, I'd like to talk about Jesus' exception. And this is one of the things we skipped over this morning because it's not really mentioned in Mark chapter 10. Jesus' exception for divorce. Now, the rule, I believe, is stated in Mark 10. And the rule is, what God has joined together, let not man separate. And so simply put, Jesus said when he was asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? In essence, Jesus said no. He said, don't get divorced. And so that is the rule. And I believe we have to understand that rule to understand the exception. Now, is there an exception to that? Is there a reason for divorce? And yes, there is. We read of this exception in Matthew chapter 5 and also Matthew chapter 19. And the one reason Jesus gave for divorce is that term we briefly looked at, that term fornication or sexual immorality. And so this comes up in Matthew 19 verse 9. And here Jesus says, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except, and so there's the exception, right? Except for sexual immorality, and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. And so if a man chooses to cheat on his wife with another person, and that wife finds out and she decides to divorce him because of that, that is grounds for divorce. And that divorce is recognized by God. Now, a wife doesn't have to do that. She can choose to forgive her husband and they can continue on in that marriage. But sexual immorality is valid grounds for divorce according to Christ. Jesus' teachings are rather strict regarding marriage. And even the apostles, his disciples, if you read Matthew 19, they acknowledged that his teachings were rather strict compared to what the Pharisees allowed during his time. And because of how strict his teachings are, there are people today who want to just dismiss, do away with what he said, what he taught. And I've heard all kinds of clever ideas about how someone can just basically find loopholes through Jesus' teaching. 1 Corinthians 7 is dedicated to the topic of marriage. And of course, the first letter to the Corinthians was written by the Apostle Paul. And we're not going to get into 1 Corinthians 7 in any detail because we'd be here for another couple hours if we did that. But I'd just like to state that I do not believe Paul contradicts Jesus in any way. I do not believe the writings of Paul contradict Jesus Christ in any way, shape, or form. I do not believe Paul or any of the other apostles provide additional reasons for divorce. I believe there is the one exception that Jesus gave. And in fact, when you take the time to read through 1 Corinthians 7, on one occasion in that chapter about marriage, Paul actually refers back to what Jesus taught. He refers back to Jesus as his authority. And Paul basically teaches everything Jesus taught. And he does address a few situations where Jesus did not specifically address some things. But even there, I believe he just teaches what Jesus taught. After Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, we read his words in Matthew 28, verse 18. Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and in earth. And I humbly ask you this evening, do you believe that statement? Because I've been confronted by some Christians who I don't think believe this statement. And they won't come right out and say it, but they believe Jesus has some authority. The Jesus Christ I worship has all authority. His authority is universal. And I believe that every single person, whether they believe, whether they don't believe, whether they're a Buddhist, whether they're a Muslim, whether they're whatever, every single person is going to be judged by his words because his authority is absolute. And so that is one of the reasons I believe what Jesus taught applies to all people. And again, I believe he made that crystal clear. Every time he talked about it, he said, whoever. And so let us be true to Christ just as the apostles and just as Paul was true to Jesus and his teachings.